So here's what I think. I can't tell you anything other than that. I can tell you what I think. And then you must think for yourselves. Right? It's not just Adam and Eve. We all have to do it. And make decisions for yourselves. I think that's an important theme today. I think it's okay. Here's the thing. We have taught people for a very long time this original sin thing, from which you needed Jesus to save you. Except that didn't change a whole lot of the sinning for lots of people. And sometimes I wonder whether or not it's the interpretations and the teachings that follow from it that take over and the message is lost. This is why I like to revisit. I don't just like to revisit stories in the Bible and try and understand them for children. Basically, that's what you got this morning, was that story from Genesis told for children. Because we can all understand that. It's about getting what's at the heart of the story. It's why the stories are so important. There's lots of people, I can tell you right now, there's lots of people who don't like that I revisit the stories and tell them a little bit differently. Because that's not what the church has taught you. I would just like you to be maybe a little bit more concerned about what the Bible itself, what the Word, what God, what Jesus teaches you, than what the church says. Okay. I'm good so far. All right. Here's why. Here's why. If I tell you that this is a story from which Adam and Eve choose to sin by disobeying God, the consequence of which God, in rightful indignation, casts them out of the Garden of Eden, the wonder of the garden, into whatever the hell this is, and you inherit that curse, how do you feel about that? Because basically what I just told you was that not only is this not God's wondrous creation that we tell you every other Sunday of the year, it's something else, but you got cast into it because, well, original sin. I've talked about this a little bit before, that if you mean the beginning, the first sin, okay, I'm on board with that. But the moment you start talking about original as in somehow you're inherently bad, I disagree. Because we have a story. In fact, we have two stories. There's two creation stories. There's that wonderful story of over 6 days, God imagines everything into being. And what's the last thing? God imagines human beings into being. And creates them in God's own image. In God's own image, he created them. I said it twice because actually it says it twice in the Bible. That's how significant that phrase is. You are created in the image of God. It got repeated. But then the very next thing that you find in Genesis is the second story of creation, in which it basically says, God imagined some stuff, but not everything, but hey, need a little help, so created human beings. And in order to do that, God takes, not God's imagination, but God takes the earth that has already been created, breathes into it the air that has already been created, and together with the water that has already been created, creates you. You are basically really nice composted earth, water, and air. I believe that can actually be proven scientifically too, if I'm not mistaken. But wait a minute. What about this other story? Why are there two? Well, see, I think there's two because this one tells you the wonder of the universe and this one tells you your place in it. And I don't mean by that to say you're dirt. But yes, you are. But here's the beauty of the two pieces of the story together. You are both created in the image of God and of the earth. That's how intimately connected to all of creation you are. And that's a wonderful thing. And if only we spent less time thinking about how we can have dominion over or subject the earth in some fashion, we might actually find ourselves treating the earth a little differently, not to mention each other a little differently. But we don't. So let's go back to the Adam and Eve part of the story. Horrible sin, they disobey God, cast out of the garden. Oh yeah, okay. What if instead, as I suggested last week, and I really, honestly, really wanted to show a clip of Admiral Akbar going, "It's a trap!" right now. Star Wars reference. Okay, sorry. Anyway, that God set it up so that you would choose, Adam and Eve would choose, make a choice, and acquire free will, because we have free will. I can't just go choose. You have to take it. I truly believe you do. You have to take the desire to choose. So Adam and Eve make a choice. It turns out to not be on the best advice, of course, but they make a choice. And in the story, to me, in the story, we hear God going, "What? How did you do that?" But to me, in the back of my head, I'm seeing God going, "Gotcha. It worked. Now, go out into the world and take care of it." See, I don't think the difference is that beautiful garden cast out into whatever, and I use that phrase purposely, because if the garden is this wonderful Eden, we even use the word now to mean a beautiful place, then what is this? Because we tell you every other Sunday of the year that this is God's wonderful creation. This is God's wonderful world, whatever, however it goes. It's wondrous, isn't it? Is it wondrous? Yeah, okay. So is it? Or is it the thing that they were cast into because they got cast out of the good stuff? See, I don't think it's a question of being cast anywhere. I think it's a question of becoming aware. Suddenly they were aware that not everything was the same. Things were different. Things were interesting. Some things more interesting than others. They could have favorites. But they could only discover that by literally discovering that. They needed to go out and engage the world. So I know what you're thinking, but wait a second, Robin, your wonderful story here of going out into the wonderful world and engaging the world kind of hits a snag, because the very next thing in Genesis is a story of Cain killing his brother. So yes, it hits a little bit of a snag there, but from the start, our default setting is good. Our experiences, our way of engaging the world are the thing that turn us towards sin. And sin is the thing, it's not about right and wrong, sin is the thing that distances you from God. So when you sin, it takes, and literally in the story, it does. It takes Adam and Eve away from God. Except, Adam and Eve might think that, but God never does. God never, ever leaves. God is the always that's always there, the love that's always there. So here's Adam and Eve going out into the world. Suddenly they're aware of all this wonderful, and I'm just going to use a really contemporary 20th century word now, diversity of creation. Let me go back to that comment about how maybe what the church has taught isn't actually necessarily leading us to the best place in terms of how we hear the story. If you think you have been cursed from the beginning with original sin, if you think you are inherently sinful, if you think you're inherently bad, if you think because of that original sin, Adam and Eve were cast out, that's the wording, cast out into whatever this is, think about how you now treat whatever this is and your perspective of your place in it. It's not good. You're here because it's a punishment for, that thing. But if you approach everything that way, even subconsciously, if you approach everything that way, it's all downhill. So think about how different the things would be if you change your mindset and suddenly you realize that you were inherently good. That the purpose of all the diversity around you isn't for you to be afraid of it, but to engage it, to discover more, to expand yourself. I know you're looking at me and thinking, I've been doing that lately, and I have, but I'll diet later. But that's, see, I was talking about this last week too, right? We think like this. We think forward. We think in a linear way. But what if we didn't? What if we thought suddenly, instead of we get older, we get more mature, instead of that, we thought our life experience expands. Our knowledge, our awareness of the world around us simply expands. Right? And again, that's why when you have an experience in the past and you think, oh, over time you forget it. But then you see something or hear something or touch something or smell something, your senses suddenly bring it, boom, right back. And it's huge again. That's why. It's because it never diminished over time. It stayed the same. You got bigger. What if we engaged the world like that? It'd be a different place. Because you wouldn't suddenly be afraid of somebody because they were different. You'd be interested and want to know more. If we didn't make assumptions about people based on their appearance, or maybe based on things that they say, or any of the criteria we usually use to decide whether or not somebody's okay, or it's somebody we want to know, or somebody we don't want to know, or somebody we want to avoid, we'd find the world a much more interesting place and a much less scary place. I know you're thinking that's a little impractical at this stage. So we've kind of had thousands of years of learning that we're inherently bad and we should be afraid of people and all of that stuff. It's a little impractical to suddenly go, yes, but what if it were different? Thank you, Jesus, for saying what if it would be different. This is such a weird story in Mark, isn't it? It's such a weird story. It's one of the temple people. It's like a scribe or a Pharisee that Jesus is saying, you are not far from the kingdom of God. Usually, when we hear stories about Pharisees or scribes or everything, they're the bad guys. They're the guys who are always trying to trick Jesus. And here's a story in which it kind of sounds like this one thought, hey, I like his answers. I'd like to know more. And involves himself in the conversation. Kind of, like suddenly saw something different and thought it was interesting instead of being scared of it. And the result is Jesus saying, you are not far from the kingdom of heaven. Why? Because what he asked him was, what's the most important commandment? And Jesus says the most important commandment, of course, it's love God. And by the way, love your neighbor as you would love yourself. And see, I think when you love your neighbor, you are loving God. When you love yourself, you are loving God, because God is in all creation. Remember, God imagines all creation into being, including you and I, who are created of the earth also. That's how intimately connected we are. So when we love each other, we are loving God. When we love God, we would love each other. And most significantly, we would love ourselves. Loving yourself, truly loving yourself, is loving God. Those things are all connected. So it makes perfect sense to me that Jesus would say that. It makes even more sense to me that the scribe would go, yeah, I like that. Yeah, absolutely. In that crowd were a bunch of people who were probably going, what? Because why would you love? And not to mention, who's your neighbor? Who's my neighbor? Clarify that for me, because I want to know whether or not I should like that guy down the street who I don't really like at the moment. Well, your neighbor is everyone. In fact, there's a story in one of the other Gospels, in Luke, where your neighbor suddenly results in the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Your enemy is your neighbor. Everyone is your neighbor. Everything is your neighbor. Love your neighbor. It just seems so obvious to me when you put these two stories together. And yet, it is so hard. So, maybe our default setting isn't good. Maybe we are inherently evil. I said that sarcastically. I hope that was obvious. See how easy, though, it is? It's easy. The only thing that's even easier is how easy it would be for me to convince you that you are inherently bad. The only other thing that would be easier would be for me to then convince you how I can help you if you just do what I say. Well, I don't want you to do what I say. I want you to do what Jesus says. And I want you to do that because you are inherently good. From the very beginning. The very beginning. It should not be so hard for us to... I know there's other factors. I know there's responding to the way people treat us. I know there's things that happen in the world. I understand all of that. And again, while you're thinking how impractical it would be to actually do it, Jesus is asking you to do it. He's not asking you to do it in the perfection of the Garden of Eden. He's asking you to do it in the perfection of this imperfectness, which is the world we live in. It isn't easy. And we don't always succeed. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Because you are inherently good. You are created in the image of God. Created of the earth, of the creation around you. And we should love each other for that. We should look at our differences and say, that's interesting, I want to know more. Even if, and I know some of you are thinking of the famous painting in my office that Judy created in order to remind me of this. It's a little frame in which is a picture of a guy playing country and western music, beets, eggplant, and a cat. 4 things I notoriously do not like. I've still tried them. To be fair, I was forced to try the eggplant. I'm looking at you. But I have tried them. And I didn't then say, you may not eat them. I didn't say, they must be exterminated from existence. Okay, I did. Okay. But I didn't mean that. I say lots of things. The point is that just because I don't like it doesn't mean you all can't have it. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't exist. In fact, all the more reason for it to exist so that others can embrace it. There's only one way to find out, and that's to engage. That's love. Loving your neighbor. Find out more. Love your neighbor. Love the world around you. diversity is a gift. It's not something to be afraid of. I so wish we wouldn't use that word. Honestly, Google, Jesus talks about diversity. You won't find any quotes. Because Jesus never talked about diversity. Just like if you Google, Jesus talks about being tolerant. Jesus never asked you to be tolerant. Jesus asked you to love. Tolerance implies there's something to be tolerant of. And Jesus' point is, no, there isn't. You should just love. Again, there's no quote for that beyond Jesus saying you should love. What there is a wealth of stories about Jesus showing us this every day. About loving your neighbor, whoever it is. Engaging your neighbor, finding out more, learning more, expanding your experience of the world by loving. Jesus didn't need to talk about diversity because every story is different. He met different people and talked to different people, and he treated them all with love. I'm going to say that differently because I think that's not the way to say that. Jesus didn't treat anybody. Jesus simply loved. It's not about how you behave. It's living what you are. You are created in the image of God and of the earth. Embrace the diversity and learn more. Let your life expand around it. Love your neighbor. Love yourself. Love God.